Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Alon Ben-Meir. Today's guest is Kiran Nazish, an award-winning journalist, professor, and founding director of the Coalition for Women in Journalism and Women Press Freedom. In this episode, Alon and Kiran discuss the state of press freedom in the United States and the transgressions that the Trump administration has committed against journalists, how the United States relates to other countries known as violators of press freedom, and how to protect journalists by strengthening democratic institutions.
First of all, I want to thank you, Kiran, for taking the time to have this podcast, this discussion with me.
Thank
Given what's been happening around us here in the United States and elsewhere, I would like, of course, hopefully we can talk about some of these very disturbing issues that have been taking place. But before I start with that, I would like our audience to know that your contribution in support of women journalists is to be highly, highly commended. And I think it is extremely important, especially nowadays, when the onslaught on journalists in general, men and women, has been so intense, even in some Western countries. And not to speak, of course, about Middle Eastern countries and others. So your work is crucial in every which way. And I just want to wish you the very best to continue this incredibly important effort. This is the one tool that we have left. People like yourself, like me, that we're going to have to raise our voices and be heard. And women who come perhaps more than even men in terms of number of journalists have a great deal to say and contribute to the ongoing discussions that be taking place in here and elsewhere. So again, thank you for your contribution in that regard.
Absolutely, and thank you for this conversation, Alon. I agree that I think women journalists and generally, like you said, we are in a time where journalism is extremely important for everything that's happening in the world. It doesn't seem like that. It's one of the last things that is left for us to be able to maintain in a healthy manner in order to have any remaining democracy.
Exactly. So perhaps we can begin with I'll ask you the question. Trump, of course, has continued to commit tremendous transgression and in connection with policies that he has adopted, both domestic and foreign. And one of the things, of course, that is bothering him to no end is the fact that we still have somewhat free press. And he is, of course, trying to do everything he can to stifle a free press. What is your take on what Trump is trying to achieve, and whether you think he will be able to make a dent on what it's going to take to stop him from influencing what journalists have and can say freely?
So first of all, I must say we are speaking just about a day after the FBI raided, a Washington Post news reporter, Hannah Nathanson. And in her home, they raided her home, not the office. It was her home. So it's an intimate location for the FBI, for the intelligence agency to raid of a journalist. So there are so many different boundaries that are crossed in this incident. And one reason that I want to mention this incident and also like just start here is because this kind of crossing the line by the state only happens after certain other transgressions and levels of transgressions have already taken place in a state where press freedom is being abused.
Right.
It's just like also really difficult for us to use these words like abuse of the freedom of the press in the United States. It feels a little incoherent because just about a few years ago, this was not really, these are not the kinds of words or concerns we would have had about the United States. Of course, press freedom has not been entirely free in the United States ever, right? If you look throughout the decades, there have been, transgressions, there have been limitations, but the kind of transgressions taking place in this moment are really of the high caliber transgressions. We would say that only happen in autocratic states or states where you would have non-democratic entities, whether it's the military coups, it happens usually under military coups or dictators or, outright dictators and oligarchs. That level of transgression is happening in the United States, and that is concerning because we don't, as advocacy organizations or civil society or citizens and journalists, don't have the time to really think about how to respond to these moments. And that's the whole point. The point of Donald Trump doing 10 things at the same time. On the one hand, we have by this moment, like since last year, since January 2025 to January 2026, we have heard from over 100 journalists in the United States who are foreign correspondents, working in the United States, that they have heard from agencies, or they've been threatened, or they have been approached, or there are different levels of transgressions that they have experienced working in the United States. We have heard from journalists, we've heard from newsrooms about the kind of instructions, quote unquote, that they have about what kind of questions they can ask, what kind of what kind of stories they can do, etc. Even the White House correspondent cohort has this understanding of what kind of stories they can tread, what kind of questions they can ask, and there's a constant day in, day out fear amongst correspondents covering DC, the White House, the Pentagon, that they could lose their ability to have access anymore. So these are really unique transgressions. We need to acknowledge that this moment, it is very hard for us to say that United States should be considered a democracy in this at this point. It's very, very important from our point of view to acknowledge that so that we can address the issue accordingly. Now, I'm not saying that democratic institutions are not in place and that democracy is not revivable in the United States. And what that would require to do is that people who are individuals, stakeholders, policymakers, even public officials, and especially public officials, to address this as a moment where democracy is being taken away from them, and to be able to work on reviving the system again, if that makes sense.
You're absolutely right. I mean, authoritarianism is want to ensure to consolidate dictatorship, to consolidate their power. One of the targets will be the press. That is to stifle the press, because they don't want any kind of reporting that is going to undermine their position or undermine their rhetoric in any which way they can. And so this is not an unusual phenomenon. And I think Trump is relentless in his effort to do just that. And of course, he has his big, Fox News that continue to inflate, continue to project and endorse, support many of the things that he's been saying. So what you have now, you have this conflicting voices, narrative that is taking place in the United States. He can always say, well, this is what is actually happening, this is being reported on. On the other hand, we know how biased Fox News is. How do you see that? And of course, my concern is that some of these major news agencies, if one gives in, then it's going to have significant adverse chain reaction to other news institutions. So how do you see, is there any way this can be reconciled? Now, given that his support, specifically from the Republican Party, to remain rather solid. So, but I want to go back to this issue of with the freedom of press. There's no question about that. How do you see that being reconciled right here in the United States in order to sustain, at least one of the most important pillars of democracy, which is free press?
Yeah. So thank you. That's a very good question. How do you reconcile? So there are two answers I have for that. I would say I just want to take a step back and say, first of all, like I said in the previous comment, it is important for us to acknowledge and witness the moment as is, which is that democracy is being snatched deliberately. Now, whether it is the FBI and, raiding the home of a Washington Post reporter or all the other, more quieter things that are happening in the background, for example, journalists getting instructions about what they can or cannot cover, there are several things going on. At the same time, you are seeing intelligence agencies doing their thing, law enforcement doing their thing, Trump doing his own thing, and it's an attack from all sides, kind of like an ambush when it comes to the media. But I think that Trump's administration is an ambush on any democratic institutions.
Yes.
The media is caught up alongside all of civil society and all of other democratic institutions. So to witness that moment is important, to separate ourselves, to say that we don't really maybe need to reconcile with this. We need to create an alternative and address it from the outside rather than being caught up in this. Now, you know that the theatrical nature of everything that's happening is, like you said, you also mentioned this, like this is not something new. I have covered dictatorships and the rise of military dictatorship, if you may, in countries, and I've covered crumbling democracies. And one of the most important and fundamental things that happens is there is theatrics. And in Trump administration, we are seeing those theatrics. They're not necessarily like, I think the way not to respond to this is to being caught up in shock and horror and say, oh, this happened. There's going to be hundreds of things that are going to be happening in this moment that's he's going to do to distract people and get them to be caught up in the moment. So as an advocate, I am very aware of not wanting to spend my energy on getting caught up in the shock and horror and come from an alternative place and look at it from the outside and see how, who are the people who still care about democracy and press freedom, and to be able to work with them and strengthen that part of the ecosystem that we do have it, right? We do have people who care about democracy and the freedom of the press and and civil society.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, other than the institutional provided by various news agencies to the various to journalists, but my feeling is also the journalists themselves ought to be more resistant, and some of them, many are. For example, take the journalists that attached to the Department of Defense. They were told by the Secretary of Defense that anything they publish has to go through a process scrutiny before it's published. And I think all of them, if not majority of them, just walked away. That without consulting the agency that they work for. And that is
I will just mention, because I know the backstory, like this is something that was communicated. Like there has been a conversation amongst journalists and cohorts of journalists going on alongside some press freedom organizations that there should be a walkout, because as Trump was coming to power, in the January of 2025, everyone was having this conversation. What are we going to do? Because some of the journalists have covered other parts of the world, and we know how these things unfold, how leaders like Donald Trump unfold. So there have been some preparatory back-end conversations that led to that walkout. And by the way, that walkout happened much later. Like there were other incidents that have happened before that sort of would have called in for the walkout too. But that was an effective move. It was premeditated, if you may.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, whether it wasn't premeditated, and probably it was premeditated. The fact is, it walked out. That sent a clear signal that we are not going to take censorship, because that is the essence of journalism, of reporting the truth, reporting what's going on, rather than merely endorsing whatever comes out of the mouth of the administration. So this is very, very important. What other step you feel that the journalist, I mean, other than not allowing other than the news agency not succumbing to the pressure coming from the administration, and the resiliency of the journalist himself or herself, not to succumb to this type of pressure, what other methods you would want to recommend to a journalist to take in order to impede, if not prevent, these type of continuing harassment? Now, of course, as is easier said than done, it probably is a little easier here in the United States, but if you go to other countries, well, they've been arrested, they've been killed, so they don't have that kind of much of a choice.
I will be so I don't want to I don't want to say something that is too dark here, but I don't okay. I don't see the difference between any other country and the United States right now. Like the kind of transgressions that are happening. I mean it's only a matter of time. So in terms of coming back to your question, in terms of what journalists can do, I think that we are right now in 2026, with everything that's happening, that the attitude of the Trump administration is showing us that in this moment, journalists don't really have independent power. And if they do something, if they do not, like say, if they are going to invite attacks. Because if you look at the current landscape, attacks are happening on journalists that are uninvited. Journalists are not doing anything for the state to target them. In fact, the news coverage in the United States is very mellow. It's not accountability journalism. It's not takedown journalism. It's not calling out journalism either. Journalists already in the liberal media I'm talking about are very mellow in reporting on what's happening. They're just trying to do as objectively as possible, but also in a very toned down capacity. I mean, in fact, there are transgressions that are happening in the United States right now that the media is not reporting. So journalists are already censored in the United States. And there is not anything that they're doing to invite the trouble that they're already getting. Even the, Washington Post reporter, like her story, if you look at it, she was trying to have a compassion, I mean, I won't say compassionate, but an empathetic point of view to try to understand what agencies go through, or what its experiences of individuals who work for agencies, right? So that story is coming from an empathetic point of view to try to, not in an accountability point of view or an attack point of view. So that's important. And then I guess if you look at the landscape, the only thing I think, coming to the practicalities, what can be done is for the ecosystem, for the civil society ecosystem, for the political ecosystem as well, the political ecosystem that believes in democracy, to sort of take this as an assessment of what has not worked, and to sort of come together and work on something to strengthen the democratic values. Because everything that's happening is because of, democracy itself not working,
But
Trump is in power
yeah,
because.
but then you have what Trump has created is an environment that is slowly imposing sort of self-censorship on journalists, like what you're saying, it's trying to, tempering their reporting to some extent, not adhering to what the administration would like to see happening. But Trump, I think, in the administration has created that environment that it is in many ways putting some indirect pressure on journalists to exercise self-censorship. And it's basically what you are saying. However, you also mentioned a point that I think there's no question there is a significant erosion here in the free reporting, in the free press, and it has to be addressed along the line also what you have suggested. But if you go to another countries, and I'd like to mention in this case Israel in particular, where during this last 2 years, unlike here, there is a pressure. No journalists pretty much have been put in jail or journalists been shot to death. But in Israel, over 100 journalists were actually killed. And in Israel, what's the reason?
But
Because
you have to understand, Alon, like, you're right. You're absolutely right. But that has a history that has unfolded to create that kind of environment. That is inevitable I think what you're saying is inevitable in the United States if you don't have an alternative system that is actually like that. We don't build an alternative system and strengthen civil society right now.
well, this is what I'm talking about. I mean,
That is where the United States is going. Like,
but I'm talking.
I feel like I will be honest with you with the kind of daily reports that we're getting from daily messages that we're getting from journalists, daily incidents that we're getting from journalists. The numbers are so high, they're unprecedented. There are times we can't even count the numbers because they're things that are happening on all sides. So the things are going so fast in the United States that I don't know if whether it will take 3 months for us, and this is a dark thing that I'm saying, for us to hear that a journalist got killed in the United
Well,
States,
it could happen.
going to prison. There's going to be some accident. These things happen by accident, right? Like you would say the state did this because the journalist was in the line of, or they were not doing, and then they start gaslighting journalists. And that gaslighting is already there. That has become an environment right now. There, you cannot have an argument with the Trump administration and say, da, da, da. So the example that you're giving of Israel, you're absolutely right. And I don't think that moment is far unless we have a political will to change that. And
Yeah,
I
but
don't see the political will.
yeah, but along what you said before, the various news agencies have to take steps. Journalists themselves will have to be more resistant, and we have to augment this kind of a more comprehensive approach in order to stifle or to prevent Trump from continuing the exert this kind of pressure, if not threats, that would eventually not lead to eventually putting journalists in jail or killing journalists. But I bring the example of Israel here. The United States exercised tremendous influence in Israel, needless to say. When you have 100 journalists were killed, why they were killed? Because Israel did not want to have them to report on the effective genocide that's been taking place there throughout these last 2 years. Then you mentioned, when I read about some of your work, you indicated, of course, journalists in Turkey, journalists in Pakistan, journalists in Iran are far more oppressed than we still haven't seen yet any of that in the United States. So it is a global phenomenon. What we are also seeing, the rise of the right of center, the rise of conservative movement throughout in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, that is also giving a push, putting more pressure on journalists because they don't want necessarily for them to report about this political trend is taking place and its a ramification on our social, economic, political development in the future. So it is a lot more, encompassing. And the question is, we have to put up a fight. For example, with all the humility, I am completely undeterred when I write about what's happening here in the United States. I'm simply undeterred because to me, the moment I begin to compromise what I have to say, then there's no point for my saying to begin with. So my question to you then, how can we change the atmosphere? And perhaps it's impossible to change it or very difficult to
I
change
don't
it.
think it's
But
impossible.
we have to make that supreme effort to change the atmosphere where the journalists will no longer will be a target, because the journalist with the freedom of press is always a problem for any dictatorial regime, and we are in it. We are in it.
Yeah. I think that I mean, so I can share with you, we can have a policy conversation about this. But I feel like I mean, if it was 2022, I used to have policy conversations, even though I myself observe things differently. But because the work requires us to look at the world, and the most of the world, we are looking at the world from a policy point of view, from a, civil society, collective advocacy, all of these point of views that we have. But in all of these point of views, I think we lose something from our perspective, is the nature of the human condition. I think that it's important to look, like, we separate, for example, I'm glad that you understand that this is something that has happened in other places and it could happen in the United States. But I would say the majority of people to this day that I'm talking to do not understand that a lot of the things that have happened, say, in Latin America, to journalists or to civil society, or in Turkey, it's beyond their imagination that this could happen in the United States. And it's the same in Europe and Canada and the UK, that, like, in some democratic countries where democracy has been a reality for the last couple of decades, and I say that pun intended,
Mm-hmm.
that there is no understanding that this is actually a human condition factor, and it's not like we are above them or we are different from them. We are actually all human species, and we're going to behave in the same way, under the same circumstances, because we are biologically and physiologically wired. So there's the same kind of human behavior that dictators and oligarchs will use to use power and suppress people. And there's going to be same kind of reaction that we will see from the public. So people who are sitting in institutions or are in civil society or in political institutions or are in the political space, it is our job to be vigilant to that and see how we are going to see, people receive what's happening, what's going to happen to, people in the country, in terms of freedoms and rights, and how should we respond to that. But
Yeah.
what I think what's happening in the political ecosystem and the civil society ecosystem right now that I find to be, like, just really dangerous is this passivity, that they're just constantly being caught up in responding to Trump. The only person that I can tell you that, like, a few people that I think in the United States who are not doing that are maybe, Bernie Sanders, or I would say Zoran Mamdani, or like a couple of others who are just focusing on doing the work and cultivating an ecosystem where we cannot tolerate, these kind of abuses, and being clear about what are democratic values and what are not democratic values.
Yeah, but then, you mentioned incorrectly, you mentioned the environment itself, that is a political environment, and it's a direct and indirect impact on the journalists, the way they work. Now, say if a journalist now is watching this and they ask the question, okay, I'm a journalist. What advice do you give me? What sort of advice should I follow in order for me to maintain my integrity as a journalist? But here we have the environment is going in Pakistan is different than the environment here in the United States. So the one advice, we cannot give all of them the same advice because their environment in which they operate is completely different. But let's test our theory here.
I just want to say a really brief thing to that note, just one sentence. Journalists are by design very aware of their environment. So I feel like journalists are so vigilant because the work they do usually on the front line is like the number one human quality that they have, intellectual and physiological, is to be aware of their environment. So whether they're Pakistani journalists or American journalists, they will be vigilant and aware of the environment. And I think we might not even need to tell them what to do because they will be, as long as they
Yeah.
know what their values are.
Wait, no, but here I think I might differ with you a bit. A journalist that operates in Iran or operate in Israel today doesn't have hardly the same freedom still what the journalists have in the United States. So the environment,
I'm
they go,
talking
I
about the
cannot,
environment and not the freedom. I'm just saying
but
they're aware of the environment. Do I have freedom or do I not? How am I going to, how I've been a journalist for 20 years before I started this organization. And one thing that I would say is that as long as your values are in place as a journalist, the question is not whether I have freedom or well. What journalists are usually asking is like, how am I going to tell the story? It's not that whether I'm going to tell the story.
but
And I
you
think,
see, you
yeah,
you as a person who's been supporting and have been encouraging, supporting journalists, especially female journalists. And I don't think we can divorce the environment in which they operate and the different environment that exists all over the world where journalists operate. And we can say, I cannot give the same advice to a journalist in Pakistan or in Iran that I can advise here in the United States,
totally.
where they still exercise significant amount of freedom in what they're writing.
Absolutely.
So what I'm looking at, journalists on the whole are under attack, just
Yeah.
about everywhere, just about
Yeah.
everywhere. They are working under certain constraints. These constraints will continue to exist, will persist, unless the environment in which they work changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now the question is, because your man is saying, depending, a good journalist is going to continue to operate with a high level of integrity because they don't want to compromise what they have to say. But then again, they are also imposing some kind of censure because where they live, where they exist, what the
Exactly. Yeah.
rules are,
They're constantly navigating. It's all
so they
constant
have to
navigation.
navigate. Now the question here, the level of which they now must compromise what they have to say is going to now begin to depend on where they are and what can they expect if they report something not to the liking of the authorities. In Iran, they could be executed. In the United States, not yet. So here we cannot really tell any kind of reporter or any kind of journalist, okay, this is what you need to do. But I'd like to discuss with you what are common denominators. What are the common denominators? A journalist, wherever they live, however they operate, from wherever they report from,
Mm-hmm.
they are under onslaught. They are being attacked. Now, can we suggest certain common denominators that a journalist ought to still operate with that sense of a freedom?
Hmm. I would say,
Or we simply cannot do so because what you are saying or talking about, which is rightfully so, they are not operating in vacuum.
I think that, like, as far as the United States is concerned, it's a war zone right now. So so there's a couple of things. You mentioned common denominator. So to that, I just want to say, like, we cannot treat the United States as a country or a democracy right now. For as far as press freedom or civil rights is concerned, it is a war zone. There are attacks on all sides. So journalists are not going to work right now thinking whether I will be able to tell the story or not. They are very aware that they're going in to do their job where they're not allowed to tell the story. And they're still telling the story. Now, I feel like, from our, from our point of view as an advocacy organization, we never make comparisons between different circumstances in different countries in the sense that in that moment we have to look at the environment of a certain country, whether it's Iran or Turkey or Pakistan or Mexico, and address the issues of press freedom or the impediments journalists face in that country. And that this is something that has been just integral, and part of our system from the beginning of when we started doing the work. And I think that one of the reasons that we were able to do that very effectively is to treat every individual and every location in specific to its own circumstances was because we were a gender-focused organization. And just by, working on gender itself, because the circumstances for women are always so specific, we already had the system installed in doing the advocacy for that work to be specific and not generic. I think that is very important when it comes to, sort of protecting the press, because when we want to protect the press, there are two kinds of things we're doing. We are protecting individual journalists, which means individual circumstances and individual places, and we are protecting the press freedom at large as an entity. And these are two different jobs. These are entirely different skill sets. And the kind of advocacy work you need, or the kind of protection you need to offer, or that you can offer, it looks different. Now, so I just, like, from that point of view, I do want to say, in the practical sense, we cannot do the comparisons, but what we can do from a visionary point of view, say, if we want to take preventative measures in the United States for press freedom, we have to then take into context what is happening in the world and what are the tendencies the United States is showing as a state towards press freedom or civil society in this moment, and then say, okay, what are the responses that we should take? And because of that, I have been saying that we need to strengthen the political civil society system and the democratic system, so that we can actually not respond and react to what's happening under the Trump administration, and create, to be honest, devise a way to remove Donald Trump from power. Like, I
Well, of
think
course.
that effort is not happening. That should be the conversation. The conversation should be, something has misplaced right now in this democracy. This is undemocratic, and if majority of the United States wants to be a democracy, then it has to take him out of power, because he doesn't belong. um, you
Absolutely.
know,
Absolutely. I mean, let's talk about what you just mentioned, which is, I think, is extremely important. That is,
and
we
I'm
need
sorry,
to.
I have no bounds anymore to be able to so openly talk about this.
I'm sorry, come again?
Oh, I just want to say that, like, I'm speaking about this openly because I think that there's no point of us not doing this right now. I know that it is difficult, and it is not entirely safe for us to say this out loud, but I
Well,
think
I
that
mean,
this is the conversation we should be having. That,
but
like,
I mean, like I said, I'd like to have this conversation as open as possible, because I think it's a critical, especially because unless there is the kind of this resistance, well, the Trump administration would succeed. There's 3 more years to go of this. But let me
he's
go
not
back to the
leaving.
institutions that we
He's
are.
not leaving in 3 years. He's destroying the country. And you know this well as well, right? Alon, you
Yes,
mentioned Israel, and examples of other parts of the world where you know that he's not going to leave, and he's destroying all democratic infrastructure. He's using emergency powers now in Mississippi.
this is true. But let's go back to the institution, because I agree with you. To protect the integrity of journalism and reporting, you have to strengthen other democratic institutions. And what he's also attacking these institutions, he's attacking universities, he is attacking the judiciary system. So how do you go now about this? So here one is linked. I mean, these institutions. When I had a discussion the other day with someone who's saying to me, I don't think Trump is going to succeed in the end, because he said we have institutions in the United States that in the end they will prevail. That these institutions are too much entrenched in our political system, in our culture, they will eventually prevail. That Trump cannot unravel, cannot destroy these type of institutions that we have, including, for example, he's pointing, for example, to the court. Still, federal judges, many of them selected by Trump himself, are opposing many of his policies on a regular basis. Because if there's a link between strengthening the institution and maintaining the integrity of reporting and journalism, But there is this notion, one who say, well, our institution now is being dramatically affected by his policies. And there are those who are saying, no, our institution still will be able to sustain that kind of pressure and eventually will prevail. What that means, if the journalism is connected to the ability of this institution to survive and continue to conduct themselves the way they're supposed to, like is caving, for example, some of the universities caving to Trump, that's a terrible sign. Some of these news media caving to Trump, that's a terrible sign. So these institutions need to be protected. So because there is a link between the two.
But do they want to be protected? That's the other thing. The institutions themselves, like the ones who are okay. So we were talking about what journalists can do, right? What can a journalist do? What can a news organization, what can journalism do to protect itself? Well, the first thing that has happened that I was predicting when Trump got elected, I knew this was the first thing he's going to do, is buy the media. Right? He has done everything that he can to either dismantle the media that he cannot buy, or buy the media and dismantle the one that he cannot buy. That's it. This is the number one thing that all dictators do because they know.
Absolutely, yes.
Then number two, attacks on the art, attacks on civil society, attacks on people's freedoms. Why is it so and to do it theatrically? Why is it so important to do that? Because he is communicating to people that you don't have power. All of the incidents that are happening right now in the United States, I mean, every single day we're getting reports about what ICE is doing. So, I mean, today, like I've gotten 5 messages from journalists who want to report on something that has to do with ICE and, they're concerned about their safety. Okay. So, like every single day, these things are happening, and he is communicating a language saying, I am in power and I have more power than you, and I can do anything if you oppose me. That's what he is communicating. So, and to the points that you mentioned that, people who say that, this cannot happen in the United States, we have the law, we have the judges. And, I also saw, Jon Stewart, who I absolutely love and respect. Just in the early days, he said something, he did a program in which he sort of took a clip of like a judge shooting down on shutting down, one of Trump's efforts of a breach of freedoms and stuff. And I was like, well, this is just a matter of time because the judges are going to start giving up. The judges are going to be threatened in real time. Right. And their judges are under so much pressure, and not all judges are following the law, by the way. We're looking at a certain states and we're like, oh, look, America is a democracy. And in this state, this does not happen. Why do you think he's targeting Minnesota right now? Because Minnesota is known to be a liberal state, and he's punishing any state or any community that wants to have the values of Minnesota so that everyone can learn the lesson. This is all theatrics. He's communicating.
Well, I mean, to Minnesota is testing ground. I just wrote a piece on that, as a matter of fact, but I just want to focus for a minute.
It's a testing ground, but you're absolutely right. It's a testing ground, but it's also communication tactic.
I think if he succeeds in Minnesota, there'll be the next city and the next
Well,
city.
today he said he's sending the troops. So
there's more troops, yeah. Instead of trying to reconcile what happened, he's sending more troops and a double down on what he's trying to achieve. I just want to focus for a minute on the relationship between the institution of journalism and free press versus other institutions. There's a bionic relationship between the two. That is, one can strengthen the other. Do you agree with that premise?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's just focus some of what this institution ought to be saying or doing, and how the press, how the journalists ought to expose what is happening to these institutions in order to bring even greater awareness to the public. So that if the two collaborate, do you feel there is enough collaboration, is enough interaction on a regular basis in a very profound way in order to strengthen both institutions? That's a
very good question, Alon. Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. So there is a very strong, has always been inherently, because of how democracy works and what the role of the press is, The role of the press is to serve the public as transparently and with as much integrity as possible. And so the role of the press is to communicate to the public what's happening in the world around them. And some of that means part of that is what is happening within the public, and part of that is what is happening between power and the public, the state and the public, right? That's the job of a journalist.
Right.
And the reason that journalism is so integral, or press freedom is so integral to democracy, is because it allows freedoms to flow. It allows information to flow within a country. So when journalists are attacked, it's the same thing as civil society. One thing affects another thing. Like when civil society is not strong, or a good, healthy political system is not strong. Just because you have political parties in the United States doesn't mean it's a healthy political system. It is a dysfunctional political system. In a healthy political system, a strong political system, a strong civil society, and a strong media complement each other. And they
Right.
ensure that there's no abuse of power, including the political system. The job of the political system is to ensure that there's no abuse of power.
Then the question comes, to what extent Trump can influence civil society to change its approach in their direction, again, the institution. That is separate from putting tremendous pressure on the freedom on the press. So from your perspective, civil society, all these institutions are the pillars that can eventually protect our democracy here and elsewhere. Do you feel that the civil society in America will eventually succumb, or they're going to put up a fight? I mean, from I'm reading it today, I mean, I think a fight is inevitable.
I think you're right, and I hope that the fight happens. I don't see it happening. I think America, okay, an honest understanding that I have come to, is I think Americans became a little passive, as I think happens in many nations and has happened to many nations around the world, is this passivity that our democracy is taken care by the vote. And so to your question, like, yes, you need a strong response, is what I have been saying throughout this conversation. Like, we need a strong response. We need a collective strong response to this. But I don't think it's happening, and I don't think there is the momentum. There is some backlash, and backlash should not be confused with a response. Response is strategic. It's there are very solid collaborations between institutions and individuals that happen in a response. The backlash against the Trump is not the same as a response. A backlash is disorienting us right now and making us believe that we are responding. But if you're called a dictator, that's not a response. That's just basically a reaction that is a waste of energy, in my point of view.
Wait, let's take an example of what happened in last week in demonstrations throughout the United States. Just about estimated 1,000 locations. The reaction was not necessarily. I just wrote a piece on the spontaneous to the killing of Renee Good.
Yes.
But it was the resentment, the anger was simmering now for the whole year. And so to me, this is a manifestation that perhaps the public is coming to a point of no return. So from my perspective, I'm saying perhaps this type of demonstration, if they are consistent, if they are relentless, if they are massive, this may very well be one of the tools by which to stop Trump. But it's got to be of that kind of magnitude, with that kind of consistency, with kind of, in a massive, massive way, and the frequency.
Mm.
Now, it happened, what appeared to be spontaneous when this unfortunate women were killed in Minneapolis. But I feel that as a journalist myself, as the one who writes about it, I'm now advocating in the strongest possible term to the American people, rise up. Because
Yeah.
if you don't rise up, this is probably the last resort to stop Trump. And that we rise up will protect the institution, will protect the freedom of press, protect everything that democracy stands for. So do you see that as a possibility? That is, and what is going to take? Because in my view, this is probably the last real major resort that the Americans have today to say, no, we are not going to take it sitting down.
You are absolutely right. So this is the last one and the only one. And you're absolutely right. And I'll just like, I think there's a nuance here, is that because this happened in Minnesota, if this happened in a Trump state, you would not have seen people coming out, right? It wouldn't have affected the same kind of community. So because this happened in a community that is rather liberal and has different values, you saw people coming out because it does not align with their values. And it's not okay with them not to feel safe. But in certain other parts of the United States, where people are okay with feeling unsafe, like you have to take it, it's a massive country with very diverse, states, where people feel differently about their safety and their sense of freedom, or they think their freedom is something else. I mean, who are all these thousands of ICE agents, right? Are like, they're absolutely, not, they don't maintain human qualities. Let's just put it that way, right?
Yeah,
So, and I don't want to go on tangent, but to your point, I just want to say, so it's important to recognize how many parts of America are willing to do this. When this happened, I was like, okay, this is happening because it's Minnesota. But would it happen in every other place? No, no. The answer is
well,
no.
you're saying no, almost categorically, when I'm saying I don't think it's a categorical no. When we look at the common denominators of what happened here, like I said, in nearly 1,000 different locations, these demonstrations have taken place. People there were on the street. They were black, Hispanic, white, from various races and religion, in
Yes.
red state as well as in blue state. So it was not limited at all
Yes.
to just
Yes.
the blue state.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is that's not all states. Do you understand? And there's so many layers to this, like how this happened. When people show anger that we're not okay with it, people watching who can resonate with that anger mirror that anger. So what happened is, because people in Minnesota cared, there was a mirroring effect, right? What I'm saying is that if this happens, so you see this happening, like the next day, there was an immigrant woman there was a woman going to a doctor. Do you see that? I mean, there's
Mhm.
so many things coming out right now that it's hard to keep track of everything that's happening. But I will tell you, from our data and things that we are monitoring, there are similar abuses taking place to immigrants, to undocumented people that are not being reported. You don't see videos. Not everyone has a camera. So a lot of information is not even coming out. And things are happening in communities across America, and especially on the Mexico-US border, El Paso. There are other places that are close to Juarez, on the other side of
Yeah.
Juarez, sorry. So there are things that are happening that are not being documented. So I think it's just, I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying it's important to keep that in mind. And the second thing is that while people are coming on the street, and I think that is important, and I hope that that happens, that the ability for people to come out on the street is equally proportional to people's understanding of their sense of freedom. If people understand their sense of freedom, they will come out on the street. If they don't, they will not. So,
I think I dare say that most American, seek freedom, want to have freedom. They're used to being free to do whatever they choose to do. What I'm thinking here is that the growing disenchantment of ordinary Republican in the street of what Trump is doing. This is a critically important part. That is, these demonstrators did not were limited to only Democrats. Based on some reporting, many Republicans who now feel, this is ordinary Republicans, who feel now he is not delivering anything of what he's saying. I'm not saying they went out in the street in the same numbers as many Democrats, but there was element of that.
Of course, of
And
course.
what we need to do, what I'm saying is what we need to do as a journalist is to encourage, because there is that kind of a disenchantment.
Yes.
The public protest is the critically, and perhaps the number one, what's left, that is what there is, in order to stop Trump. And so we're going to have to galvanize the public opinion in that direction, and capitalize on the growing unhappiness of many ordinary Republicans of what's going on in the country. Be that the inflation, all the things that are unhappy.
All of those things. Yes, you're absolutely right.
So again,
And by the way, I'm not disagreeing with you at any point. I do not disagree with anything that you're saying. I'm honoring what you're saying and just putting in my nuance that I feel.
No, I appreciate the answer. You're absolutely putting the important nuance to all of this discussion. There's no question about it. My feeling is that I'm not prepared to be despairing yet. I'm not despaired.
Yes, and so I will say that, it's a philosophical question that sometimes when you say I am not prepared, the philosophical question is essential to ask why is that and what are the values that you have, that it's a strength in a way, right? To not be not be in despair, to not accept.
Yeah, but that's not just about me. What I'm saying is every journalist, almost regardless where they are.
Exactly.
When I talk about that sense of saying, I will not stop, I will not, no matter, however the constraint may be, the spirit of resistance, the spirit of resistance of a journalist must not die.
And the spirit comes from a sense of freedom, the idea that freedom cannot be taken. The truth is that in any human life, we often look at these as outside things, as structures, as laws. But what all of this is really about a conscious quality that human beings have, that freedom is, all of freedom belongs to every individual.
This is right. But to protect the freedom, to protect that freedom, in order for me to operate freely, I may have to sacrifice something.
Yes, exactly.
I may have to take a risk.
Exactly.
And this is one of my main concerns, that is many journalists eventually compromising what they're reporting on because they're not prepared to take the risk. And I'm not saying everybody should take a risk and put their life on the line. But the extent, that is, if we were to strengthen this institution, we have to consider that we are going to have to operate in an environment where it is also risky.
Yes.
But however risky it may be, we should not be compromising or stop reporting with that. I don't want to come, because the moment I'm compromising a story, it is no longer worth.
So I will say, to your point, I will say that something that you've been asking, and I've been going back and saying, like, well, journalists can, in that I've been going back into describing the environment. One thing I want to say that I wish for American journalists right now, that you're saying that kind of like sort of also answers your question that you were asking, is that the one way American journalists can go ahead with not compromising and still telling the story is by working outside. I mean, that's something that American journalists have not tried. Something that a lot of, in a lot of countries, Turkish, Egyptian, Pakistani media, when the media comes under attack in when you have these dictatorial powers rising or tendencies increasing in a democracy, the number one thing true journalists do is they leave. And they report from the outside. This has happened for decades, for at least 2 decades. Post 9/11 world, we have seen many countries around the world where journalists have gone and sort of like worked from other parts of the world to be able to tell the truth, because they will be shut down in their own country. And American journalists should give it a shot as well, I think.
Yeah, I would like you to have the final word on one particular question. You are a celebrated journalist. You are very much involved in protecting journalists, women journalists, in advising and directing in the organizations you have created, which is admirable. When you report yourself today, to what extent you allow yourself to be governed by the pressure that is being put around you?
0%.
Allow yourself to be government. To what extent do you compromise? Do you compromise?
Zero. Zero.
Yes, no?
0%.
0%. So this is
And I will say that the nuance there is like 0%, but what I have done throughout my career and also just with the organization is like I've created circumstances. It's not just that we are allowed to not have not have be under the pressure, but we have you have to cultivate an environment and a strategy to be able to do that work from untraditional ways sometimes.
but presently you are in the United States, so you do not have necessarily that kind of pressure where you are forced to compromise. But if you were to report from
We are
Pakistan,
under a lot of pressure.
well, pardon?
There is a lot of pressure.
There is, of course, but we're not compromising. You are not compromising. I'm not compromising.
But not because of the United States. I am not compromising because we have other countries that we work from.
In principle, you don't want to compromise. Now, am I right? In principle, you will not allow yourself to compromise. But let me say, when you talk about environment, and just say you're reporting from Pakistan,
yeah,
would you be able to say the same thing?
So what I'm trying to say is that I think that yes. So the way I'm just going to talk about how I work and how, like I have sort of led the organization to work is that if we have an issue with compromising in a certain place, we would do our work from the outside. So there are certain issues that we have faced and are facing in the United States, but we are not addressing those issues from inside the United States. So
But that does not allow a complete freedom because you are not witnessing firsthand what's actually happening. So you're reporting from outside, and you are obviously going to be losing many of the nuances that actually taken place. So here there's a compromise because you cannot operate as freely in Pakistan as you can operate from the United States.
So we are not doing that. So just so you know, like since we're talking
No,
about
I'm asking you because
you asked my question.
Yeah.
We are not doing that. When something is reported, of course, it is reported in direct communication and confrontation of the issue. So I understand what you're saying is that and that is something that I was saying as well earlier, that do we have the tools for journalists to not compromise? We cannot put it on the journalist if we don't have an environment. I mean, the journalist should not have to make a choice between telling the truth for the public and not compromising on their value and getting killed. That's not a fair environment to put on any human being.
That's right. But given what you're doing, so what do you advise those journalists who do not have the same freedom that you have today? So what do you tell them when they ask you, what should I do? What would you say? Report from the outside, take a risk? No, this is not a hypothetical question.
So exactly. So what I have been saying throughout this conversation, and I'll just reiterate that, is that we are not in a moment where we can tell journalists what to do. Number one, journalists don't need us to tell them. Like so what kind of help that a journalist needs from any institution, whether it's the organization they work for, the media organization, or an advocacy organization, is to give them the support, aka the environment where they can report freely. That's all. That is our job as outsiders, right?
Well, of course
as advocates.
Of course you don't
But
tell
if
them
we
right.
cannot give them the environment, the only thing we are there, our relationship with the journalist, is that we can provide them the security they need. So what we do, our approach, I will just tell you what our approach is. Our approach is this. I'm not saying this is how every advocacy organization works. I think that some advocacy work and civil society work or human rights work is like a rather imposing. It's like, let us train you how to go into a war zone. Let us give you all, like if journalists are getting killed in a war zone, we have this approach of like telling journalists what to do. I think it's not our job to do that. I think it's our job to ask the journalists, what do you need to deliver on your work, and then what can we do and how can we support you in your job? That's our job. And so it's important to make that distinction, and that is our approach towards like when we are protecting her. It's also not our job to tell journalists like where to go, and how to tell the story. Although, of course, we have created ecosystems, we have peer support groups where we allow journalists to communicate with each other, take
Right.
advice from each other, get mentorship around those issues. But as an advocacy organization, our effort is to create a supportive environment where journalists can do their job.
Right. And I just want you to conclude what you've been saying. How do you assess the success of your campaign, your effort in offering that kind of support, that kind of protection? I'm sure you're at it, you're winning, you're working in it day in and day out. Do you see the difference that you are? I'm sure there is a difference. Can you quantify that? Do you feel that you are making a dent? How do you assess that?
I think that I assess that. So, like I said, like we are in an emergency scenario, right? Like, just globally, right? Like there have been not a time where there have been so many conflicts, and we are caught up in Iran, and we're caught up in Latin America, and we're caught up in Afghanistan. Like today we kind of had like several cases from Iraq. Like it's there are parts of the world that are neglected. Poland, Belarus, like there's so much going on. So we we are in a global emergency
Mhm.
when it comes to protecting the press. No one likes the press right now. Okay. And the press is on its own everywhere in the world.
Right.
Okay. The institutions that used to support the press in the last decade, until the 2020s, before the pandemic, those institutions are not supporting the press anymore. I'm talking about democratic institutions. Now, press is literally has come on its own. So it is a very what we are doing right now is just responding to an emergency. It's kind of like we are trying to grasp for air. In honest terms, at press freedom advocacy, all we are able to do is provide safety or get people out of a dangerous situation. What I will say that what is not working that used to work before 2021, even 2020, before until 2022, we have been able to get journalists out of prison. And, in countries, we have been able to lobby with governments to release journalists. We've done various advocacy works that I do not think is possible right now because the laws are weaker. The laws are not being followed. Judicial systems around the world are weaker. And the kind of advocacy that used to work because there was a priority for human rights and democracy, or even a window dressing kind of
Mhm.
priority, that allowed us to do some sort of advocacy work and come to some sort of effectiveness. Right now, my focus is not only while we are doing the protection work and all that, that is, ongoing. My focus is to build, look at the future and build something new, which is to strengthen the democratic and civil society institutions, which is what I'm working on right now. I mean, you might be familiar with our new initiative called Revive Democracy, which is
Good.
an ecosystem of over 250 civil society organizations, political individuals from political backgrounds and policy and all that, to sort of work on strengthening democracy and the relationship between democracy and civil society. That is because we are in an emergency mode right now. So all that is going to happen out of this, if we don't build a solid infrastructure for democracy, is that we are going to be under the emergency. And so that is not something that will keep us alive, in a democratic kind of world anymore. So
Well, and I'm going to have to leave it at that. I want to.
yes, we've just it was I mean I just didn't realize that US conversation is just really stressful right now. There's a lot to
We
to
have a
talk
lot, and hope we'll have another opportunity to continue this discussion. Thank you again so much for taking the time. You have added tremendous content quality to this very critical discussion about where do we go from here as a journalist, and what is our task, and how can we protect ourselves to do a better job. So thank you again for your input.
Thank you, Alan. And I just want to acknowledge that, like, I thank you for your very wise questions and your nuanced questions. And I thank you for doing the work that you're doing, and what you believe in is you are right on that. And I appreciate speaking to you about
The
that.
pleasure is mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. All the best.
All right, you too.
Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.